Hello and welcome back for another 10 Talk. We're so excited to have with us Emily Price once again. Miss Price has joined me today to talk about a very interesting topic. Can Catholics have tattoos? And that's the question we're going to jump right into. Is it something that Catholics can do? Is it sinful or is it evil? And that's kind of the question that you have investigated a little bit on.
Yeah, that's a very good question, Father. And actually, I was very personally invested because, well, I didn't tell you this, but I got a tattoo last weekend.
Oh, yeah?
I'm just kidding. No, I didn't. No, I didn't. I have
It's funny because neither of us actually have a tattoo, but we do have the questions, that often come up, and I'm sure you as parents as well have a point where maybe one of your children asks you that question as well, or maybe you yourself have had that question. And so we'd like to give some light on this topic.
Especially because they're so trendy, and a lot of people get tattoos, not just for the sake of getting a tattoo, but a lot of people actually have questions about, well, what if I want to get a religious tattoo? What if I want to get something with Our Lady?
Or a scripture passage or a cross, those kind of things. Is that okay to have or is it not, right?
Yeah, so I actually took the research for this 10 Talk very seriously because I really wanted to dive in and see is anyone making an actual case to say this is sinful? So I researched the web left to right, and there were two main objections that I encountered when it came to talking about tattoos and whether or not they were sinful. So number one came from a passage in Leviticus 19:28. And the passage reads like this: "You are not to make incisions in your flesh on account of the dead, nor submit to cuts or tattoos. I am the Lord." End quote. Now, this was the first kind of scriptural reference that I found saying something against tattoos. And upon further exploration of this, one thing I found is there's a difference between moral law and ceremonial law. So the book of Leviticus was actually written for the Levites. And the whole idea of it is that it's meant to instruct the Levites, the priestly people of the Jewish people, how to set themselves apart from the world. And so you'll notice here it said incisions in your flesh on account of the dead. So there were certain rituals and things where people would make marks on their body to identify with the dead. Or they would get certain tattoos to associate themselves with different tribal identities. And what God was speaking to these people in these ceremonial laws is that you do not have a tribal identity. Your identity is that you're part of the people of God.
And it's interesting because also in our baptism, we could say that is the tattoo that we receive as Christians, is that mark on our soul that identifies us as children of God, right? And so in a sense, we already have a tattoo, but it's on the interior and it's expressing who we are, our identity.
Yeah, so the book of Leviticus, God is saying to his people, don't mark yourself with any identity other than that I give you as my children. And that's real. The spirit behind that law is something that we need to keep nowadays in the modern era. But again, this is a ceremonial law that was meant for the Levites as the priestly people of the Jews. It's not necessarily a moral law. It doesn't have a moral teaching for us. The second argument that I heard that tattoos were sinful or could border on the line of sinful was one priest in a talk that I listened to described them as a form of self-mutilation. And he said that therefore it is wrong because self-mutilation is not a good thing. It's not of God. But then I went and I talked this out with one of the teachers here at Clearwater, who is one of the professors of religion here. And so we talked about it. And as we were talking, got into the topic of some of the practices of mortification in the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
There are still
yourself, out of penance, trying to get closer to God through those acts of a mutilation, but somewhere out of that pain that you feel and trying to offer it to God and trying to make yourself uncomfortable in order to recognize that this world is not where we're supposed to be. It's eternal life that we're moving towards.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a modern practice among many religious groups today. And it's a beautiful practice of offering up prayers and suffering for the church. And
Always with the guidance of your spiritual director.
Yes.
Yes.
Very important qualifier. Do not go and do this of your own volition. Make sure you have someone very who's advanced in the spiritual life who can guide you in that sort of thing. And then another point that I found interesting in that one talk that I listened to was the same priest also admitted, though, that it was appropriate for women to get ear piercings, which in my mind, I thought, well, those are two very similar things. Like, they do similar things to the body, right? Like a tattoo pierces you several times, just shallowly on the skin, and an ear piercing, you go right through. So I wasn't convinced. But on the other hand, if we were to sit down and have a conversation like we are right now, all of us could identify a time when we have seen someone who has very clearly taken tattooing and piercings way too far. Way too far. Like, there are those horn implants that you can get, and it just naturally we know that something is, ooh, that's a bit off. So it would seem that there is a line where tattooing could become a form of self-mutilation. And it may be hard to draw that line, but one article that I read said just because it's hard to draw a line doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. And the example he gave was, okay, you go outside in the evening and you hang around outside. At some point, the cool of the evening becomes cold. But you can't necessarily identify where exactly it went from cool to cold. Unless you're in Canada, then it's just always cold. But that doesn't mean that it didn't switch, because everyone agrees. Yep. Suddenly the evening was much colder than it was.
Yeah, that's a very important idea of having a line, right? And understanding that that does exist. There is a truth out there. We have to keep searching for it, right? Even if we can't identify it right away.
Yeah, exactly. One point, though, that I did love from my research under this point was that, I don't know if it was the priest that I was listening to in the talk or if it was the article I read, but they pointed out that a fact of our reality, a fact of our lives, is that we don't actually get a complete right over our bodies. They're not actually 100% ours, because our bodies, just like our life, is a gift from God. And the only thing that's actually 100% ours is our will. And we need to care for our bodies as the gift that they truly are, given to us by God. So in summary, are tattoos innately sinful? No. From what I researched, I would conclude no. But there is a point where they may become sinful.
That would be crossing the line, right?
Yeah, the line.
that line that's so hard to see.
Yeah, exactly. So another thing, though, that I found in my research is some helpful tips and pointers for deciding either what to get, where to get it, when to get it, and why to get it. So the primary lens that I think you need to look at tattooing through is this lens that the body is sacred and is a living temple of the Holy Spirit. I found this amazing quote from St. Thomas that says, "You need to treat your body with the same affection of charity with which we love God." Which is incredible, that we need to treat our bodies with the same amount of charity that we would show to God. But it makes sense, right? Because we are living temples of His Spirit.
It's like adorning your temple, right? And it's out of glory for God, not out of self-glory, right?
Yeah.
So it's looking for that identification, again, as a child of God. How do I express this, that I am a child of God?
Yeah, and that will be a recurring theme in this talk, is that idea of intention. Why are you doing what you're doing? And that's something you should be applying all across the board anytime you do anything, not just get a tattoo.
Great question for your kids. If they're asking that, how are you adorning your temple? Is that why you're doing this?
Exactly.
Interesting.
Excuse me, 18-year-old. Yeah, so on that same vein of my body is sacred and is a living temple of the Spirit of God, what we do with our body matters profoundly. And we need to ask ourselves, does this detract, what I'm about to do, does it detract from my dignity? And is it in good taste? Okay, so keeping in mind the sacredness of the body and our dignity as human persons, beloved by God, here are some key ideas to consider before committing a tattoo. So, number one, It must not disrespect the human person or the human family. Pretty basic. Number 2, it should not be motivated by vanity, self-hatred, or pride. Again, we're coming into that, like, what is your interior disposition in seeking this thing? Number 3, is getting this tattoo divinely motivated or motivated by self? And this is where, as Father mentioned earlier with the forms of mortification in the Catholic Church, it would be very helpful and handy to have a spiritual director, or even just a close friend, someone who knows you really well and can point out,
Someone can help you make that decision. Give you a confirmation or help you to go in a different direction. Right?
Yeah, exactly. Number 4, consider both the image and its placement. So this came from, I'm not sure if you've ever heard of Father Mike Schmitz, but if you haven't, look him up because he is an incredible resource for how to talk to teenagers about this because he's so in touch with the youth.
He works with university students, and so he has a real insight into all the things going on in their lives. Knows how to talk to them.
So these points came from him, and his thing is, okay, there are some things that Catholics should not get. Number 1, Catholics cannot get images of evil things. So if it's crude or if it's satanic, that's a big no. And I think we know that intuitively. Number 2, he pointed out, and this was something I hadn't thought of, but where you get the tattoo matters. He said that there are some places on your body that if you got it, it could be a use or a misuse of your sexuality. So number 5, you need to think long term. So whatever you're thinking about getting, or whatever your teenager, your son, your daughter is thinking of getting, can you live with this as an employee, a spouse, a parent, a priest, or a religious? Because especially for teenagers that haven't found their vocation yet, like, buddy, the world is open before you. You don't know how much you're going to change leaving high school.
And it might create a lot of limitations in your future as well, right? Where you can be hired, where you can work, what you need to do in order to move on to the next step. So,
And I mean, yeah, tattoos have become much more, I think they're less taboo than they have been in the past, but there's still a bit of a thing with them. Okay, so then some suggestions that Father Mike Schmitz had for determining if you really like what you're looking at is, okay, think 10 years ago, what would be the tattoo that you would have wanted? Now, today, would you still want it? So that's a good test. And then
cartoon character on your shoulder.
Yeah, exactly. A big Daffy Duck right here.
Big Superman, something. Maybe not so much today.
Yeah, exactly. And then his second test was, okay, so you've thought of a tattoo, you really want it. Okay, fine. Silk screen it on a t-shirt or an undershirt and then wear that undershirt every day for a year. If you still like that image, then it's likely that you will like that image for at least a year afterwards. And number 6, the amount of tattoos is important. And here Father Mike Schmitz started talking about how some people seek tattoos out of self-loathing. So again, asking yourself, what am I saying if I feel compelled to mark up my body? Like, what am I seeking?
Yeah. Going back to the intentionality again, right? Looking at why am I doing this? The why is very important when you're asking these questions about a change that's going to be somewhat permanent for the next period of your life, right?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Okay, so another branch, so moving on from what to consider, I did find some actual Catholic affirmations of tattoos. Instances where members of the church have come out and said that this could be a good thing. So one of those is from the book that Father Michael's always talking about, the Catholic Catalog. You should check it out. It's a very handy resource. Their chapter on tattoos talked about this Catholic Council of Northumberland in 786. They deemed a Catholic bearing a tattoo for the sake of God worthy of praise. And then they also had this story about Coptic Christians who have been a persecuted minority for as long as they've existed, basically. And it is a long-standing tradition for them to mark themselves with a small cross on the inside of their wrist, forehead, or temple, despite the consequences of being a minority and a persecuted minority. And they would actually tattoo their children because it was often the case that their children would be taken away from them and then forced to convert to Islam. So they wanted to do that to mark their children for Christ. That these kids and I and myself, we belong to Christ.
That's beautiful. And I think when you see it in that sense, you say, oh, well, that tattoo, that's definitely not wrong, right? Intuitively, I think we already see that, but I think it's a good point to bring up.
Yeah. And then I also read some stories of people who, after going through a major conversion to Christianity or to Catholicism, they wanted to get a tattoo as an outward sign of an inward conversion. And because of its permanence, it also was symbolic of the lifelong commitment that they planned to make to Christ. I found the Catholic Catalog had this great quote too, talking about how the saints of 2020 and 2021, because there will be saints from these generations, but they might look different. And I'll just read you the quote. It says, quote, "Tattoos with religious themes remind us that the saints of today may look different from those of ages past. What remains the same is the light of Christ shines through them all." End quote. Yeah, that's pretty much all I had. I wanted to end just with this challenge that Father Mike Schmitz gave at the end of his video. And I paraphrased it. Ultimately, he said, "The hardest and most tangible testament of a person's commitment to God will come through the way that they live their life, and not by how they decorate their body." And this is me speaking. And believe me, in this day and age, just living a holy life is enough to get you recognized as a Catholic.
Well, thank you so much for joining us for this TED Talk, and thank you, Emily, for your input and your research and investigation that's helped us to hopefully have a better understanding of what is the Catholic position on this topic. And hopefully it has also triggered some thought in your own personal life and your family life and helped you to answer some questions that may come up in the future, or maybe you had some questions about in your own family. So take this time, this week to reflect on these things and put it into your folder of things to come up in the future that might be helpful for you to answer bigger questions. God bless you and have a wonderful week.
Yay!